We're going to check the fuselage. We check the top of the fuselage to make sure that the air vents and antennas are intact and that there's no frost or debris on the airplane. We're going to check the side of the airplane also to make sure that there's no contamination. The static port is located with one port on either side of the tail of the aircraft. The static port is a hole that measures the number of air molecules around the aircraft. That measurement is then transmitted through a tube up to the airspeed indicator, the altimeter, and the vertical speed indicator. If this hole is plugged, you lose the input from those three instruments. Not a terribly good thing to have happen. The empennage is also known as the tail feathers. We're checking the leading edge of the vertical fin, we're checking the rotating beacon, the screws along the top of the rudder, and we're also checking the VOR antenna. We're going to check the leading edge of the elevator. We're also going to check the screws on the on the elevator tips, both on the top and on the bottom. We then check the elevator for proper movement up and down, and we check for movement in a vertical dimension to see if our bearings are in good shape. We're going to check the anti-servo tab and check and make sure that each of our hinges is in good shape. We're going to check the screws and make sure that they're intact on our tail cone on both sides. We're then going to check and make sure that our attachment points for the elevator are intact, and we're going to look down inside at the bolt to see if the connection point is good for the cables to the rudder. Checking the movement of the elevator on the opposite side, checking for movement or play in a vertical dimension, checking our screws on the top and on the bottom, and then the leading edge. We also check the static port on this side of the aircraft, as well as for any damage along the side of the fuselage. On our flaps, there's a rod end bearing, and we want to move it back and forth and make sure that it moves freely. We then tip our flap down and check our attach bolts underneath the flaps. Let's do that again. We're going to push the flap all the way down and check and make sure that there is a nut on the bolt that secures each of the attachment points for the flap. There are 3 of them. Underneath the aileron is the rod end bearing that we need to check and make sure that it's also moving in the right direction. We need to check the hinges on our ailerons, make sure that they're secure. Then we check the screws along the top of the wingtip and underneath the wingtip. We check our wingtip lights to make sure that they're intact, and if we're going to be flying at night, we will check those for proper operation. We check the bottom part of the wing to make sure that there's no damage to the wing, and we're also checking the inspection covers to make sure that all of the screws are in place. The vent and drain tubes are on each tank. The vent is at the highest point of the tank, and the sump drain is at the lowest part of the tank. We want to check and make sure that the vent is completely open and free so that air can flow into the tank, allowing fuel to flow from the tank to the engine. We check the sump with a fuel tester to make sure that there's no contaminants in the fuel, whether they be debris or water. We'll then open the fuel tank, dump the uncontaminated fuel back into the tank, and then look inside the tank and make sure that we don't have any contaminants. We check the leading edge of the wing. Looking at our stall warning vane, we want to make sure that the stall warning vane moves freely in an up and down direction. The pitot tube should be checked to make sure that the hole is open. The tube actually senses the number of air molecules flowing into the tube across the wings. Those air molecules then go through the tube up to the airspeed indicator, and referencing that to the static port, the airspeed indicator is able to indicate how much airflow is generating lift for the wings. We're going to check the vent on the main tank and make sure that it is open. You'll notice that the jack point is to the right of that tank, that vent. We want to check all of the screws that secure the tank in place and make sure that they're all secure, both on the bottom. We want to check the screws that secure the tank in place, make sure that they're all intact. We check our struts to make sure that they have at least 4 fingers of height, and we want to make sure that they're clean. This one's not clean, so let's get it cleaned. Let's go. We're going to get some fuel from the tank and then use that fuel to clean the strut all the way around. If the strut is not clean, the debris that's on the strut can interfere with the seals that hold the hydraulic fluid in place. When we check the brakes, the disc, which is in the center right here, is then checked also with our pads to see the amount of space right in here to determine the thickness of the pad. We need to sump the tank as on the tip tank and make sure that once we've sumped it, we've pulled the tank down, and then we're going to check for the quantity and contamination. We'll go ahead and take the extra fuel that we've sumped and put it in the tank, and then we'll look inside the tank at the tab to make sure that we have proper quantity of tank. See the tab down there? We want fuel. Normally at the tab, that would be 17 gallons of fuel in this aircraft. As we look at the side of the aircraft, we want to make sure that our windows are clean and that our vents are operational. We'll then check the tabs that secure the cowling in place and make sure that the tab is underneath the little lip and that the screw is in a horizontal position. We'll also check each of the screws and make sure that they're tight and secure. We want to check the baffling in the nose cone area and make sure that it is intact, and then we're going to look up inside the fuel compartment, or the engine compartment, make sure that the fins are unobstructed and that we can get proper cooling.